Well, ladies and gentlemen, a scandal is breaking out in the European Union again, but this time the situation is really critical. Hungary, led by Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, with whom Brussels cannot even physically get along, has decided to veto the extension of sanctions against Russia. Yes, the very sanctions that European bureaucrats update every time with the certainty that another tightening is about to destroy the Russian economy. True, so far the destruction has been observed rather in Europe itself, but somehow it is not customary to talk about this. The sanctions expire on January 31st, and this became a kind of wake-up call, because there will be no extension without a unanimous decision of all 27 member countries of the bloc. But Hungary, a small but extremely stubborn country, suddenly became indignant and refused to sign this collective ritual of Western countries. It's time to throw sanctions out the window and establish relations with Russia without restrictions, Orbán said, clearly enjoying the moment. European politicians are in shock, and it is still unclear what to do. Some diplomats already admit that if no agreement can be reached in the coming days, then this crisis will have to be resolved on January 27th. If an agreement fails even then, the European Union will face a legal conflict from the 1st of February. The business community is confused, because formally the ban on working with Russia may disappear, and companies will be faced with the choice of either resuming trade with Russia or waiting for new bureaucratic instructions from Brussels. According to leading analysts, Orbán's move not only irritates Brussels officials, but also undermines the very concept of the EU's sanctions policy. Hungary has repeatedly stated that sanctions are doing more harm to Europe than to Russia. According to the European Economic Center, since the introduction of sanctions, the EU economy has lost about 400 billion euros, while Russia has managed to adapt, establish trade with Asia and minimize damage. Hungary was simply the first to decide to tell the truth. The sanctions policy had failed, said French economist Jean-Michel Lambert. The issue is really complicated because even if the sanctions are legally terminated, it is unclear how the business will behave. Some companies may take this as a signal to resume trade with Russia, while others will expect a political solution. In Germany, there are voices from representatives of the industrial sector who claim that the continuation of sanctions will primarily hit the Europeans themselves. Wolfgang Hellmann, president of the Association of German Machine Builders, said that the German economy is already suffering from the energy crisis, the loss of the Russian market, and rising inflation. A further escalation of sanctions could lead to the collapse of many businesses. What prompted Viktor Orbán to take such a radical step? Brussels is strangling Hungary financially. For several years now, the European Union has been freezing financing intended for Budapest, under the pretext of non-compliance with democratic standards. According to the official version, Orbán does not sufficiently respect European values such as judicial independence and minority rights. However, the real reason is obvious. Brussels simply cannot tolerate the Hungarian Prime Minister pursuing an independent policy. Orbán has long refused to support sanctions unconditionally and is actively trying to block military aid to a well-known country, openly declaring that this conflict is not Hungary's business. Moreover, he proposed an alternative model to negotiate with Russia directly rather than through Brussels intermediaries. It's time to admit that the policy of isolating Russia has not worked. The EU has lost the economic war, said Hungarian political analyst Thomas Molnar. Orbán's policies annoy Europe because Hungary is constantly going against the mainstream. Orbán regularly travels to Moscow without EU sanctions, develops a dialogue with Russia, and promotes an alternative point of view on the conflict in Eastern Europe. And now he is also trying to unite the far-right forces in Europe. An important factor is also the change of power in the United States. On the very first day after taking office, Donald Trump began to destroy everything that Brussels had been building for so long. He rejected the Green Agenda, promised to disperse inclusive reforms, and questioned the assistance to a well-known country. Orbán saw this as an opportunity and decided to act, realizing that now is the best time to attack the Brussels bureaucrats. He is supported by other politicians in Europe. French MEP Gilles Brun said Orbán was the first to challenge the Brussels dictatorship, and others may follow. Against the background of all these events, Russia remains cool-headed. The Kremlin has already stated that negotiations with Brussels, Paris, or Berlin should not be counted on. since Europe is not independent today. However, the Hungarian Prime Minister clearly expects that his démarche will help make the European Union more accommodating. Perhaps Orbán hopes to mediate between Russia and Europe in the upcoming negotiations, especially since there are already rumors in Washington about the preparation of some kind of deal on the conflict in Eastern Europe. The media reports that the lifting of some sanctions against Russia may be one of the key conditions for concluding this deal. And in this context, Orbán's actions look like an early preparation of the ground. So this is a classic political gambit. Orbán is going all in, knowing full well that Brussels cannot afford serious retaliatory measures against Hungary right now. Trump is taking steps that completely contrast with the EU's agenda, Russia is biding its time, and the European Union is frantically looking for ways to get out of a situation in which one obstinate Hungarian is destroying the entire strategy of the collective West. Anyway, if the sanctions really don't last, it will be the biggest diplomatic failure of the European Union. Viktor Orbán seems to have decided to finally take Hungary out of Brussels' control and, perhaps, pave the way for a more pragmatic European policy with his rebellion. Or the European Union will find a way to silence him. But as the story with Orbán shows, such tricks do not work. The show is just beginning. Meanwhile, friends, Viktor Orbán has finally stopped balancing the pressure of the European Union and Hungary's national interests. Now he openly challenges the elites running Europe. In his last speech, Orbán stated that he intends to wage an open struggle against those who are pushing the European Union into leftist radicalism, destroying the national identity of member states and pursuing policies that make Europe dependent on global financial institutions. In fact, this is the first time Orbán has made it clear so directly that the confrontation with Brussels is reaching a new level. Now it's not just a disagreement between Hungary and the European Union over migration, national sovereignty, or anti-Russian sanctions. This is a struggle for the future of Europe, in which Orbán expects to play a key role by uniting around himself those who share his views. Conservative forces, dissatisfied with the course of the European establishment, support Viktor Orbán. And the most interesting thing is that he clearly feels support from outside, primarily from the United States, where the arrival of Donald Trump and the growing influence of Elon Musk in European politics create favorable conditions for him. The Hungarian Prime Minister has repeatedly stated that the current course of the EU is leading the continent to decline. In his recent interview with KSD radio station, Orbán bluntly said, quote, "The European Union should be a union of free nations, not a tool for spreading globalist ideology. We will not allow Brussels to decide what economic, migration, and social policies Hungary should pursue." He also added that many European countries have already realized the harmfulness of the agenda imposed by Brussels, but they are afraid to openly speak out against the EU due to threats of sanctions and economic pressure. These statements by Orbán did not go unnoticed in the European press. French political scientist Pierre-Antoine de Lofos believes that the Hungarian leader seeks to form an alternative European Union based on the principles of national sovereignty and conservative values. If Orbán can get major countries like Italy, Germany, and France on his side, we will witness the biggest political crisis in the history of the EU, says Lofos. But what has changed and why is Orbán acting so boldly now? The answer lies in the fact that powerful allies have appeared on his side. One of the key factors that gave Orbán confidence was Elon Musk's active intervention in European politics. In recent months, Musk has shown clear sympathy for right-wing conservative forces on the continent, using his former Twitter platform to promote uncomfortable topics for the European establishment. A real political earthquake was his recent interview with Alice Weidel, the leader of the Alternative for Germany party, which the German leadership is trying its best to marginalize. During the conversation, Weidel said that Germany is on the verge of disaster due to sanctions against Russia, the closure of nuclear power plants, and the uncontrolled influx of migrants. She also called for normalization of relations with Moscow and for the resumption of gas supplies through the Nord Stream. The fact that Musk provided a platform for the AfD leader caused a real hysteria in the German political class. Vice-Chancellor Robert Habeck said Musk was undermining democracy, and Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock even hinted at the possibility of sanctions against the billionaire's company if he continued to interfere in German politics. The newspaper Der Spiegel published an article with the eloquent headline, "Elon Musk wants to reformat Europe," which explicitly stated that the American billionaire was playing on the side of the far-right forces. But Germany is just one of the countries where Musk has begun to actively support right-wing politicians. In the UK, he sympathizes with Nigel Farage, who returned to politics after Brexit and is now actively criticizing London's migration policy. In Italy, Giorgia Meloni is of interest to him, and in France, Marine Le Pen, whose National Unification Party has already become the main opposition to the Macron regime. Against this background, Viktor Orbán is acting ahead of the curve. He has already held a series of meetings with potential allies, and his diplomatic visits have become part of a strategy to form a new right-wing conservative bloc in Europe. Last year, he met with Marine Le Pen, where he discussed issues of European integration and migration. This year, he held talks with Geert Wilders, the leader of the Freedom Party in the Netherlands, as well as with representatives of the Conservatives in Italy. At a conference in Budapest, Orbán made a speech in which he explicitly stated that he wanted to create a conservative international. We must unite to fight Brussels and the globalists, or liberal propaganda. Europe must return to its roots, its culture, its traditions, Orbán said, outlining his position. Expert Christophe Bonnet from the French Institute of Geopolitics notes that Orbán used to be a loner in his struggle, but now he is striving to create a real conservative alliance. If Marine Le Pen, Geert Wilders, Nigel Farage, and the AfD party join him, it will be the biggest challenge to the European Union in its entire history. The European bureaucracy has already begun to prepare for a counterattack. New sanctions against Hungary are being discussed in the European Parliament, which may include the freezing of European funds for Budapest. The EU even talked about the possibility of depriving Hungary of the right to vote in the Council of Europe. Guy Verhofstadt, one of the main supporters of European integration, said that Orbán is leading Hungary to leave the EU, and if left unchecked, he will create an anti-globalist coalition that could destroy the entire European Union. Nevertheless, the EU's economic problems are growing, and anti-Russian sanctions have hit Europe itself, not Russia. Against the background of growing protest sentiments in France, Germany, and Italy, Orbán's chances of success no longer look so slim. For the first time in a long time, Orbán is not just defending himself but going on the offensive. He is gathering a coalition, he has allies, and Musk and Trump are providing the necessary media and political support. The only question is whether the globalists will be able to keep control of Europe, or whether it will really change. It is already obvious that the struggle for the future of the continent is entering a crucial phase. Meanwhile, changes are taking place in Europe, although not the way the political elites imagined when they looked at the future of a united and indivisible Europe. Instead, we are witnessing a wave of strengthening of the positions of right-wing forces throughout the European Union, the very ones who were recently bypassed, considered irrelevant and even threatening. But here is the reality. In Austria, Hungary, and Germany, these forces are firmly on their feet like never before. Take Austria, for example, a country where right-wing forces are becoming more influential every year. As noted by the Austrian political scientist Gert Helle, Austria has been in a state of political turbulence for several years, and the right-wing forces are accumulating support every year. This is due to the fact that more and more people feel that their values and traditions are under threat. In recent years, the FP party has been actively criticizing both the EU's migration policy and the obsessive attempts by European bureaucrats to equalize all countries under one denominator. Statistics show that 55% of Austrians support the idea of tightening migration policy, which gives right-wing parties a great chance of further growth, especially in small towns and rural areas, where migration is perceived as a threat to security and cultural identity. As for Hungary, it has long been a joy for globalists, who nevertheless hoped for this country's propensity for political flexibility. No, Hungary is heading for independence, and Prime Minister Viktor Orbán is not shy about showing the world that he is not going to obey either Brussels or any right-wing doctrines. Interestingly, against this background, Orbán actively attracts Russian resources and criticizes the West for its too bourgeois and arrogant approach. Thus, Europe is on the verge of significant changes. The right-wing forces are gaining strength, and perhaps the future of the continent depends on whether they can unite to resist globalist trends, or whether the EU will be able to maintain its unified power. Statistics show that 60% of Hungarians support Viktor Orbán's policy of strengthening sovereignty. This confirms the opinion of experts that Orbán has become a symbol of resistance against bureaucrats in Brussels who are trying to impose their will on all European states. According to Hungarian expert Laszlo Kovacs, despite the constant pressure from the EU, Hungary stands firm in its positions. This makes the country increasingly attractive to powers such as Russia and China, which are looking for allies in Europe to counter Western hegemony. Kovacs also notes that Hungarians are tired of the pseudo-democratic practices of the West, which they consider a threat to their sovereignty. This is confirmed by the results of polls in which 72% of Hungarians opposed an increase in the EU's powers in the field of migration. Do not forget about Germany, a country that until recently was considered a stronghold of liberal and democratic values. In recent years, amid the migration crisis and growing discontent with Angela Merkel's policies, the popularity of right-wing forces in Germany has been steadily growing. The Alternative for Germany party is becoming more and more influential and is actively asserting itself in the political arena. Political scientist Harald Schumpeter writes that Merkel and her successors, including Olaf Scholz, were unable to cope with the consequences of the migration crisis and economic instability, while right-wing parties filled the vacant seat, filling the political and social gap in society. Interestingly, statistics show that 1 in 4 young Germans supports right-wing parties, which is a serious challenge for the country's political system. It is important to note that right-wing parties in Germany are beginning to focus not only on the migration issue, but also on environmental issues, energy policy, and a return to traditional family values. What will happen to Europe in the coming years? Everything points to the fact that the European Union, as we knew it, may soon become only a historical monument, and the crises it will face will become an inevitable part of its legacy. However, Europe still has a chance. This chance lies in the fact that the continent can regain the status of independent states that are not subjects of elites that no one has chosen. We see what is happening in Sweden with its migration policy, and how Poland and Hungary are resisting EU attempts to impose their ideals. Europe is going through difficult times, but it is possible that the crisis will lead to the EU finally realizing that freedom and independence are much more valuable than endless integration and unification. In any case, it remains to be seen how Europe and the world will move into a new era where conservatism and national interests can become a new trend. Friends, thank you for your attention. Be sure to write your opinion about the material. See you later.